Hello and welcome to our third installment of Beowulf. And we have the battle with Grendel. So we started off, Grendel was introed, upset because he wasn't invited to the party. Also, it seems like he's inherited sin, as he's called a son of Cain. And he's referenced as a demon, all sorts of things. And he goes into the cantina, the mead hall, Herot, which is kind of like a heavenly allusion to it. Kills everybody at night, so they stop going, and it's a big sadness. So there's this huge, dark sadness. And then Beowulf, our hero, is introduced, and he brags on himself quite a bit, and others do as well. And he seems to be infallible. Comes and answers the call by the Danes, leaves Sweden to do that, I believe. And now we have the battle with Grendel. He's been celebrated by King Hrothgar. They've had a little bit of a party in the mead hall, and they're experiencing their old traditions again and excited. And then they fall asleep on the floor, and now we have the battle with Grendel. Introductory material. After the banquet, Hrothgar and his followers leave Herot, and Beowulf and his warriors remain to spend the night. Beowulf reiterates his intent to fight Grendel without a sword, and while his followers sleep, lies waiting, eager for Grendel to appear. Any sort of indication as to why Beowulf is a hero here? Is it possible that it's because he's choosing not to use a sword and to fight this giant monster? Could be. So I'm looking for my Apple Pencil. I cannot find it, therefore I can't make notes. Underline without a sword. Anyway, here we go. Out from the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to High Herot. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before, knew the way, but never before nor after that night found Herot defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. He journeyed forever joyless, straight to the door, then snapped it open, tore its iron fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. Last readings, we focused on all of these dots, which are alliteration. From, foot, marsh, misty, hills, hatred, bogs, bearing, he, trap, trip, high, Herot, swamp, sliding, silently. Another poetic device found in early Anglo-Saxon epic poetry is this Caesura, which is this natural pause in between lines. We do that in modern English with a comma. But it's not as important at what's coming up, and that's going to be Kennings, the third and most important literary device, perhaps, of Anglo-Saxon poetry. It's a compound metaphor in reference to somebody else. For those of you kids who walk in late, if I were to refer to you as the late ones, that's a compound metaphor referencing you. That is a kenning. So anyway, Hrothgar's men are chilling, and they've been drinking some and are sleeping on the floor, and the one not invited to the party comes and stalks them in their sleep. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce, grab the alliteration. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with a gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall, crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together. And his heart laughed. It's been like 12 years. It's time to eat again. He relished the sight, intended to tear the life from those bodies by morning. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. And then we have a conjunction, everybody, but, and this is where we're going to see this shift. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Let's talk about fate right here. This is really kind of, it might be a pagan concept, right? At this point, Christendom has sort of infiltrated Northern Europe and this pagan story, and so they've sort of injected Christian illusionary material, references to Job and Christ and God and heaven, of a Judeo-Christian nature. And so this fate versus free will, it's kind of interesting, but it makes sense because this was a pagan story that Christians were telling the story and kind of putting stuff in. And if we go back previously, remember Hrothgar, as they're trying to fight Grendel and make him stop his ways, stops praying to God and starts praying to the pagan gods. And so we have this interesting paradox, dichotomy, contradiction, juxtaposition, and it happens here too with fate versus free will. That's another theme that we see in other English literature. Fast forward 16 or 600 years, and we're chilling with Shakespeare, who references this theme quite a bit: fate versus free will. Anyway, fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. If you see dots, this is alliteration. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. This is Beowulf. He was moderate in his celebration the night before, or this night I should say. He's not asleep, he's waiting. Grendel snatched at the first yate, this is the name of Beowulf's people, he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins and bolted him down, hands and feet. Death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Life is kind of, the concept was personified. That's really cool. So one of Beowulf's men gets eaten. Beowulf is still waiting for his chance. Then he, Grendel, stepped to another still body. Who's this still body? It's this guy, Beowulf. Clutched at Beowulf with his claws, grasped at a strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper, quote unquote, because he's not really sleeping. And Grendel was instantly seized himself. Claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. They're playing Mercy right now. But Beowulf is yoked out. He's kind of a Chris Hemsworth sort of Thor. At least that's what I see in my mind. Chris Hemsworth, if you're listening, you're a handsome dude. Let's work out. Here's the first two examples of Kennings in this third part. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime. These are two Kennings to reference Grendel. Kennings are compound phrase metaphors. Shepherd of evil, guardian of crime references Grendel. So he knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh and hide there. This was a different Herot than the hall he had emptied. But Higlac's follower, this is now a kenning for Beowulf. Beowulf follows a dude named Higlac, remembered his final boast, meaning I'm going to hold on to him and kill him. And standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fists till they cracked, clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer, Grendel, fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. Look how the bully has become the bullied. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Herot was a miserable journey for the writhing monster. And how joyous for the listener thinking about, yeah, we got you, sucker. Line 290. The high hall rang. Its roof boards swayed and Danes shook with terror. Down the aisles that battle swept. Angry and wild, everyone's awake now. Herot trembled, wonderfully built to withstand the blows, the struggling great bodies beating at its beautiful walls. Shaped and fastened with iron, inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Its benches rattled, fell to the floor, gold-covered boards grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Herot to stand forever. Only fire, they had planned, could shatter what such skill had put together. Swallow in hot flames, such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. And to me, I believe this is more kind of heavenly illusionary language, how heaven looks, perhaps the gates and the decor and ornamentation. And really it was a place for congregation, of being together. And if Hrothgar is the sort of godlike king, it would make sense, because the way heaven is described in New Testament scripture often is people surrounding the throne, saints surrounding the throne, singing praises for an eternity. And that's kind of like the mead hall, as we're all sitting together in congregation in one accord, singing songs of heroes and praise of others. So it's a beautiful place to be, not just a place to imbibe. The mead hall, that is. Suddenly the sounds changed. The Danes started a new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemy, Kenning, sang in the darkness, the horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat. Hell's captive, another Kenning, caught in the arms of him, Beowulf, who of all the men on the earth was the strongest. That mighty protector, Kenning, mighty protector of men is a Kenning for Beowulf, meant to hold the monster till its life leapt out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. Referencing this, it's in reference to Grendel. He feels sometimes like a person, but not when we reference him as an it. Sort of like Frankenstein's monster is always called the monster, or an it, but never a he, right? You kind of wonder, did Grendel have an argument against the prejudice against him, right? Had he been invited to the party? And it's always sad to me when we read literature or see movies of characters written that never have a chance, that they're forever condemned, right? No chance of redemption. I like to think that everyone and all of us have a chance. So, meant to hold the monster Beowulf holding Grendel till its life leapt out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords. I gotta just change the pencil feature because I want to start underlining stuff. Ancestral swords was right. I lost it. Ancestral swords. If you knew a smith and you had the money and you could engage in purchasing his high art, you would have had a beautiful sword made, and you would have passed that on to your kids and their kids, and most likely it would have been Damascened or Damascus steel. Oops, what am I doing? Don't do that. Hide. What is this? I don't know what that is. Hold laser tail? What does that even mean? All right. A Damascened blade would have looked something like... See that pattern in the steel? It's the same as famous Japanese swords that are folded over and over and over again, and it gives them this beautiful design. But a Japanese katana, for instance, is polished out, so you never see the fold pattern. And there's several different types of fold patterns that you can order from a blacksmith or a bladesmith, and they would have been beautiful. There's a famous Viking sword called Ulfbert. I think it looks like this. Ulfbert. Might have the spelling wrong. Look it up. There's a little documentary on unearthing this sword, or I should say it was maybe a smith's name who made a specific type of sword. When they've analyzed the structure of metal and the crystalline kind of composite, they found that it is Damascened, folded steel, but it was done in such a way with such early technology. No one knows how they were able to do such a thing. It's really fascinating. So most likely these dudes' swords, that would be Beowulf's men, were holding these types of swords. So anyway, so all Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised and ready, determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open up a path for his evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. Why is that? The sharpest and hardest iron could not scratch at his skin, for that sin-stained demon, Kenning, had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. So he's got power, and he's impervious and cannot be killed by conventional weapons, as they say. And yet his time had come. His days were over, his death near. This is parallel structure and beautiful language as we repeat the same grammatical structure of those clauses. His death near, down to hell he would go, swept groaning and helpless to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. And in Scripture, when the inspired writer speaks of the demon-possessed man, when referenced, I think he says, "What will you have us, son of man? Will you cast us into the lake that burns with eternal fire?" And then I think this is the same story. And when asked the demon's name, they refer to themselves as legion. So there was 1,000, right, in reference to the Roman word. 1,000 demons in this poor guy. And you just think about that. Grendel will be going to this place because apparently he's fated to do so. And these individuals will be tormenting him for an eternity. God save us all. Now he discovered once the afflictor of men, that's a Kenning for Grendel, tormentor of their days, same thing, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. It was like feuding, and this is a reminder to me, I think of Jacob in the Old Testament wrestling with God all night long until the sun comes up. A lot of commentators believe that God there, or the angel as his reference, was Jesus. and that this was sort of a methodical practice. It was symbolic, and that Jesus ends up, or this angel, taking Jacob's hip out of joint where he would maybe always limp on that leg, renaming him Israel. Do I have that story correct? Beautiful story. Look it up. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast, Higlac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulders snapped. Muscle and bones split and broke. And what happens here? Bam, bam! When my mom told me the story as a child, she always said that Beowulf ripped off Grendel's arm and beat him to death with it. But apparently Beowulf just simply ripped off Grendel's arm and then watched as he ran away and then bled to death. Doesn't have the same zing, but it's cool, just the same. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he was, could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. That's very sad to me. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. Ha ha ha! Victory! He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, purged Herot clean. Beowulf was happy now. With that night's fierce work, the Danes had been served. As he'd boasted, he'd serve them. A prince of the Yates had killed Grendel, ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced on Hrothgar's helpless people by a bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof, hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it, was the monster's arm, claw, shoulder, and all. So he nails it or lashes it to the rafters, which is hardcore. And then in the morning, crowds surrounded Herot, warriors coming to that hall to see what's going on from faraway lands. Princes and leaders of men hurrying to behold the monster's great staggering tracks. They gaped with no sense of sorrow, felt no regret for his suffering, went tracing his bloody footprints, this is all parallel structure, his beaten and lonely flight to the edge of the lake where he dragged his corpse-like way, doomed and already weary of his vanishing life. The water was bloody, steaming and boiling in horrible pounding waves. Heat sucked from his magic veins, but the swirling surf had covered his death. Hidden deep in murky darkness, his miserable end as hell opened to receive him. And this marsh is, hundreds of feet deep, and we're going to see in the next story, Beowulf dives down to the bottom of it. It's pretty rad. Let me finish quick. Then old and young rejoiced, turned back from that happy pilgrimage, mounted their hard-hooved horses, high-spirited stallions, and rode them slowly toward Herot, again, retelling Beowulf's bravery as they jogged along. And over they swore that nowhere on earth, or under the spreading sky, or between the seas, neither south nor north, was there a warrior worthier to rule over men. But no one meant Beowulf's praise to belittle Hrothgar, their kind and gracious king. So they're respecting Hrothgar. And this actually also might be biblical allusion in the book of, is it 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, when Saul has David as a general, and people start singing future King David's praises, and Saul is sort of like, what's up with that? What about me? But Hrothgar, there's no mention of him actually having jealousy here. But anyway, they're being respectful of the people, and sometimes when the path ran straight and clear, they would let their horses race, red and brown and pale yellow backs streaming down the road. And sometimes a proud old soldier who had heard songs of the ancient heroes and could sing them all through, story after story, would weave a net of words for Beowulf's victory, tying the knot of his verses smoothly, swiftly, into place with a poet's quick skill, singing his new song aloud while he shaped it, and the old songs as well. And don't we hope someday, God willing, that some scop, some storyteller will sing of our exploits and victories. And if not, God willing, we'll be praised in the next life. God bless you all, and I hope you've enjoyed the battle with Grendel.